In the blood-soaked soil of the American West, some wounds never heal. For a Lakota warrior named Hinto, the massacre of his family left a void as vast as the plains themselves. He asked the spirits for a sign, for a reason to keep living, and they answered, not with a vision, but with the cry of a woman, trapped in a ravine, her life being crushed beneath the weight of her dead horse. He saved her a stranger, with eyes the color of the summer sky. But he never expected that the greatest danger wasn't the wild frontier or the soldiers hunting him, but the devastating secret she carried in her own blood. The year is 1877, the air in the Paha Sapa. The Black Hills was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and cold stone. For Hinto, whose name meant blue stone in the tongue of the Wasichu, each breath was a prayer he no longer believed would be answered. Grief was a physical thing, a heavy buffalo hide draped over his shoulders, suffocating him day and night. It had been a full cycle of seasons since the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, the Long Knives, had descended upon his small, peaceful camp. They had come for gold and for land, but they had taken his world. His wife, Kankuna, and their 5-year-old son, Hokshila, were gone, their spirits sent on their journey by a fury of gunpowder and steel. Hinto had been away on a hunt, tracking a great elk. He returned to silence, and smoke a scene of carnage that had burned itself onto the back of his eyes. Now he was a ghost in his own sacred lands, a man untethered from the life he knew. He hunted not for a family, but for sustenance. He moved not with purpose, but with the aimless drift of a single cloud in an endless sky. He was tracking a deer along the spine of a ridge when a sound unnatural and sharp cut through the whisper of the wind. It wasn't the cry of an eagle or the complaint of a coyote. It was a scream choked off into a pained whimper. He froze his body a taut bowstring. His first instinct, honed by months of survival, was to fade back into the trees. Any stranger could be a threat, a prospector, a soldier, a bounty hunter. The world of the white man was encroaching everywhere, its noise and its violence poisoning the quiet places. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a desperate plea swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. It wasn't the cry of a warrior or a rough man. It was a woman. Against his better judgment, against the cold, hard knot of bitterness in his chest, Hinto moved toward the sound. The honor of his people, the teachings of his father were a current too strong to fight even in his grief. He found the source at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine, a place where shadow clung, even at midday. A fine bay mare lay on its side, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. It was dead. Pinned beneath the horse's heavy torso was a woman. Her traveling dress, a deep blue muslin, was torn and stained with dirt and blood. One leg was trapped, and from his vantage point, Hinto could see the unnatural bend in it just below the knee. Her face was pale with shock and pain, her blonde hair the color of winter wheat, fanned out in the dust. He watched her for a long moment, his face an impassive mask. She was a Wasichu, one of them, the people who had taken everything from him. The spirits were playing a cruel joke. He could turn around, walk away, and let the land claim her. It would be justice in a way, a small, hollow payment for the debt of blood he was owed. He could leave her to the sun, the coyotes, and the silence. The woman's head lolled to the side, her eyes fluttering open. They were a startling, piercing blue, like shards of a fallen sky. They found him, and for a heartbeat there was no fear in them, only a raw, desperate plea. Then her eyes rolled back, and her head fell limp against the earth. A sigh, harsh and ragged, escaped Hinto's lips. He could not do it. He could not leave her. To do so would be to become the monster he hunted in his own heart. He was Lakota. He was a man. He could not let even his enemy's daughter die like this. Carefully, with the silent grace of a predator, he began his descent into the ravine. The work was brutal. The horse was a dead weight, over 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone. He needed leverage. Using his knife, he cut away the saddle and bags, tossing them aside. He searched the ravine, finding a sturdy fallen pine limb. For the next hour, he fought a war against gravity and flesh. He dug at the earth beneath the horse to create space, his hands raw and bleeding. He positioned the log, straining with every fiber of his being, his muscles screaming in protest. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sweat of his exertion. Finally, with a great groaning heave and the sickening sound of shifting weight, the horse rolled just enough. He scrambled, grabbing the woman by her arms and dragging her free. She was light, fragile in his grasp. He pulled her a safe distance away and collapsed beside her, his chest heaving. Her leg was bad. The bone had broken through the skin, a jagged shard of white visible through the torn fabric of her stocking. She was losing blood, her pulse, a faint, thready beat against his fingers. He looked at her pale face, a face that should have filled him with hate. Instead, he felt a strange, unwelcome stirring of protectiveness. This was not a soldier. This was not a policymaker from Washington. This was life flickering like a candle flame in a gale, and he had just fought to keep it from being extinguished. He had saved her. Now he realized with a sinking heart, the true challenge had just begun. He had to keep her alive, and he had no idea why. Darkness was a threat. With the coming of night, the cold would creep into the woman's bones, and the predators would begin their patrols. Hinto knew he couldn't stay in the exposed ravine. He needed shelter water and fire. Working with grim efficiency, he fashioned a crude travois from 2 long poles and the woman's saddle blanket. Every movement sent waves of pain through her unconscious form, and a low moan would escape her lips, a sound that tightened something in Hinto's chest. He packed what he could salvage from her saddlebags, a small leather-bound book, a water canteen that was nearly empty, a silver-backed brush, and a small pouch of coins that he ignored. These were the trinkets of a world he didn't understand. He added his own meager supplies, dried venison, a flint and steel, and a small bundle of sage and sweetgrass. He gently lifted her onto the travois, her head lolling against the rolled-up blanket he used for a pillow. The journey was slow and arduous. He pulled the travois up the steep side of the ravine, his moccasins finding purchase where a booted man would slip. He moved through the dense pines, following a path known only to him and the creatures of the forest. He was heading for a place of refuge, a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall that his father had shown him as a boy. It was a place of memory, a place he hadn't visited since his family was gone, for fear the echoes of their laughter would be too much to bear. They arrived as the sun bled orange and purple across the western sky. The cave was small but dry, and deep, shielded from the elements. He laid her down gently on his own bedroll, near the back of the cave, the roar of the small waterfall masking any sounds. Her fever was already beginning. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch. The leg was a swollen, angry mess. He knew if the putrid sickness took hold, she would die. He worked by the growing light of a small, smokeless fire he built near the cave's mouth. He tore strips from her petticoat to use as bandages. He cleansed the wound with water from the pure stream that fed the waterfall, his touch surprisingly gentle. From a leather pouch, he took dried willow bark, crushed it into a powder, and mixed it with a little water to make a paste. He knew it would fight the fever. He then found the leaves he needed yarrow, a plant his mother had called warrior's herb, to stem the bleeding and fight infection. He made a poultice and carefully applied it to the horrific wound before binding it tightly. The most difficult part was setting the bone. He had seen it done, had done it himself on animals, but never on a person so delicate. She cried out in her delirium as he worked her hands weakly trying to push him away. "Be still," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. It was the first thing he had said to her, and she was not even awake to hear it. "The pain is a river. Let it flow through you, do not try to dam it." He worked for hours, his focus absolute. He splinted the leg with 2 straight branches and more strips of cloth. He forced sips of willow bark tea between her cracked lips. He sat back on his heels, his work done, and watched her. In the flickering firelight, her features softened. She looked young, vulnerable. Who was she? What was a woman like her doing, riding alone in the Black Hills, a place the government had cleared, but which remained fiercely contested ground? She tossed and turned, muttering names he didn't recognize. "Father, no, I won't. Please just let me go." For 3 days, she was lost in the fever dream. Hinto did not leave her side. He hunted close by, bringing back a rabbit for broth. He changed her dressings, cleaned her, and patiently spooned water and broth into her mouth. He sat through the long nights, listening to her ragged breathing, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. The silence was broken only by her murmurs and the constant song of the waterfall outside. In those quiet hours he found himself talking to her, or perhaps to himself. He spoke of the stars the way the Lakota saw the spirits of their ancestors in the sparkling river across the sky. He spoke of the elk he had been tracking, its majesty and strength. He did not speak of Kankuna or Hokshila. Their names were stones in his throat. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. He was changing the cool cloth on her forehead when her eyes opened. They were no longer clouded with delirium, but clear and sharp. The brilliant blue focused on his face, and fear stark and immediate seized her. She scrambled backward, a choked gasp escaping her lips, her body screaming in protest as she jarred her broken leg. Who are you? Where am I?" Hinto remained perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. He held up his empty hands to show he meant no harm. "You were in a ravine. Your horse fell." His English was deliberate, learned over years of trading. She stared at him, her eyes wide. She saw a man whose face was all harsh angles and weathered lines, his black hair long and unbound, save for a single hawk feather tied at the temple. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic. His eyes were the darkest brown, and in their depths she saw a profound sadness, an ancient weariness that startled her. He was not the savage of the stories her father told. You saved me," she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. He gave a slow single nod. "I set the bone. The fever has passed." Tears welled in her eyes, born of pain, fear, and a sudden overwhelming wave of gratitude. "Thank you," she breathed. She tried to sit up, wincing, as a fresh jolt of agony shot up her leg. My name is Selena." He considered her for a moment. He did not offer his in return. Names had power. For now he was a shadow, a caretaker. He pushed a small wooden bowl of broth toward her. "Eat. You need your strength." Selena took the bowl with a trembling hand. As she sipped the warm, savory liquid, she studied the man who had pulled her from the jaws of death. He was an enigma, a figure of silent strength and sorrow. She was alive because of him. And as she looked around the small fire-lit cave, she realized she was completely at his mercy. The days that followed unfolded in a slow rhythm dictated by the rising sun, the healing of bone and the cautious dance of two strangers from warring worlds. Selina, trapped by her injury, had no choice but to rely on Hinto. Hinto, bound by his own code of honor, had no choice but to provide. The cave became their small universe. During the day, sunlight would filter through the cascading water painting, shimmering patterns on the stone walls. At night, the fire pushed back the oppressive darkness, creating an intimate circle of warmth and light. Their conversations began as a trickle, small questions and simple answers. "How is the leg?" he would ask each morning, his voice low and even. "It hurts," she would reply honestly, but less than yesterday. He would nod and then unwrap the bandages to inspect and redress the wound. His touch remained impersonal, yet incredibly gentle, his long fingers working with a surgeon's precision. Selina, who had been raised in a society where even a glance at a woman's ankle was scandalous, found herself feeling no shame or fear under his care. His focus was on her healing, nothing more. It was a professionalism she hadn't expected. She learned he was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He would leave for hours at a time, melting into the forest without a sound, and return with food, a brace of grouse fish speared from the stream, a handful of bitter but nutritious roots. He taught her which berries were safe to eat, and which would kill a person before sundown. He showed her how he fashioned a snare from a vine and a sharp stick. "My father," she began one afternoon, then stopped herself. She couldn't talk about her father. "The men I grew up around, they couldn't do any of this. They command armies, they run businesses, but they would starve out here in a week." Hinto was sharpening his knife on a smooth river stone. He didn't look up. "Their strength comes from numbers and noise. The land rewards silence and patience." In turn, he began to ask questions of his own, his curiosity, a slow-burning ember. He was intrigued by the book she had saved, the only possession she seemed to truly treasure. It was a collection of poems by a man named Keats. "What do the markings mean?" he asked one evening, gesturing to the book in her lap. "They are words," she said, surprised. "Stories. Feelings. Like a winter count on a hide?" "Yes," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Exactly. Only these are the winter counts of one man's heart." At his hesitant request, she began to read to him. Her voice, soft and melodic, filled the cave, weaving tales of nightingales and Grecian urns of love and loss in a world so far removed from the Pahasapa. It might as well have been the moon. He would sit across the fire, his eyes closed, listening intently. He did not understand all the words, but he understood the rhythm, the sorrow and the beauty. It was a bridge between their minds, a shared space where they were not Lakota and Wasichu, but simply a man and a woman finding solace in a story. A fragile trust began to grow. She told him she was running away, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man she despised, a captain in the army. She spoke of a life in a fort, a gilded cage of dinner parties, and suffocating expectations, a world where she was seen as a political asset, not a person. "He is a cruel man," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "He enjoys the power he has over others. My father believes it is a good match. He believes strength is the only virtue." Hinto finally looked at her, then his dark eyes holding hers across the flames. "A man who must show his strength is not strong. The mountain does not announce its size. The river does not boast of its power." At that moment, Selina felt more understood than she had in her entire life. She realized he was not just a survivor. He was a philosopher, his wisdom drawn from the earth and the sky. She began to see the world through his eyes, the way he would stop to listen to the language of the birds, the way he could read the story of a day's events in a set of tracks, the deep spiritual reverence he had for the land that had also brought him so much pain. One afternoon, he brought her a piece of wood, softened by the river, and handed her his knife. "Your hands are idle. It is not good for the spirit." Hesitantly, she began to carve. Her first attempts were clumsy, but under his quiet guidance, she started to shape the wood. The focused work calmed her mind. She carved a bird, a hawk, its wings spread wide. She was trying to capture the likeness of the one whose feather he wore in his hair. When she was done, she held it out to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt like a spark from the fire passed between them. It was the first time they had touched for a reason other than her injury. His expression was unreadable, but he studied the small wooden bird for a long time before carefully placing it in his medicine pouch. The air in the cave shifted after that. The space between them became charged with an unspoken awareness. The glances lingered a moment too long. A silence would fall that was not empty, but full of questions and feelings that neither of them dared to voice. Selina found herself watching the play of firelight on his strong profile, the way his long hair fell over his shoulders. She was drawn to his quiet dignity, his gentle soul encased in a warrior's exterior. Hinto in turn fought a war within himself. This woman with her sky-blue eyes and her soft voice was chipping away at the fortress of his grief. Her laughter, a rare and beautiful sound when he told a story of Iktomi. The spider trickster was like the first spring rain on parched earth. She was awakening a part of him he thought had died with his family, and it terrified him. To feel again was to be vulnerable again. To care for her was a betrayal of the memory of Cancuna, and yet he could not stop it. She was not the faceless enemy he hated. She was Selina. She was brave and kind, and she read poetry by firelight. In the heart of the sacred Black Hills, in a cave of echoes and sorrow, an impossible, dangerous flower was beginning to bloom. Nearly 3 weeks had passed. Selina's leg was healing well. She could now stand for short periods using a crude crutch Hinto had fashioned for her. The sharp edges of their differences had been worn smooth by daily proximity, replaced by a comfortable intimacy. The unspoken attraction between them had grown into a powerful magnetic force. One morning Hinto returned from his hunting rounds, his movements tense and sharp. The usual calm he carried was gone, replaced by a grim urgency. "What is it?" Selina asked, her heart beginning to pound. "Riders," he said, his voice a low growl. "Soldiers, a patrol of 10. They are following the creek. They will pass this way by midday." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced Selina's bubble of security. "My father," she whispered. "It must be him. He sent them for me." Hinto's face was grim. "They will not find this place. The waterfall hides the entrance well, but we must be silent. No fire, no noise." He quickly doused the fire, the sudden lack of its crackle making the cave feel cold and dead. He scattered the ashes and covered the spot with fresh dirt. The air grew thick with tension. Hinto stood near the mouth of the cave, concealed by a rock formation, a still and silent sentinel. Selina sat further back in the darkness, her crutch in her lap, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Hours crawled by. The only sound was the eternal roar of the waterfall. Selina's imagination ran wild. She pictured the soldiers discovering them, pictured Hinto being captured or killed for helping her. She pictured being dragged back to Fort Abraham Lincoln, back to Captain Jennings, her brief taste of freedom turning to ash in her mouth. Then she heard it. Faintly at first, then growing louder, the unmistakable sound of shod horses picking their way over rocky ground, the jingle of harnesses, the murmur of men's voices. They were close, so close. Selina held her breath, her body rigid with fear. The voices became clearer. She could hear the distinct, authoritative bark of an officer. Spread out. Check every crevice, every overhang. The colonel wants her found, and so do I. Jedediah, you and Silas check that ridge line. Selina's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was clipped arrogant and laced with cruelty. It was the voice of Captain Marcus Jennings. She intended. She saw Hinto stiffen. From her vantage point, she could just see the patrol through a gap in the rocks. They were dressed in the familiar dark blue of the U.S. cavalry. On their company guidon flapping in the breeze was the insignia she had seen her entire life, a number 7 crossed with sabres. The 7th Cavalry, her father's regiment. One of the soldiers, a young man with a nervous face, stopped near the waterfall to fill his canteen. He was mere feet from their hiding place. Selina's heart felt like it would hammer its way out of her chest. The soldier glanced at the waterfall, his eyes scanning down the rock face. For one terrifying second, she was sure he saw them, that he was looking right at her. Hinto's hand moved slowly, silently to the knife at his belt. His body was coiled, ready to spring. He would not be taken alive. But the soldier simply took a long drink from his canteen, wiped his mouth on his sleeve, and turned away. "Nothing here, Captain," he called out. "Just a waterfall. Keep moving." "Captain." Jennings's voice snapped back, already moving downstream. Slowly the sounds of the patrol faded, replaced once again by the roar of the water. They waited in the tense silence for another hour before Hinto finally moved. He turned from the entrance, and the look on his face stopped Selina's breath. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. His eyes, usually so calm and deep, were blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred. He wasn't looking at her, but through her at the ghosts of the men who had just passed. The long knives, he said the words like stones, spit from his mouth. The 7th. Selina felt a deep, inexplicable dread creeping up her spine. It was more than just the danger of the patrol. It was the change in him. The fragile bridge of trust they had built over the last few weeks seemed to tremble, threatening to collapse. "They are my father's men," she said softly, a pointless admission. He looked at her then, and the hatred in his eyes did not soften. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as Selina, the woman who carved birds and read poetry, but as something else, an emblem, a symbol of the world that had destroyed him. "Your father," he said, his voice flat and devoid of all warmth. "He is a commander of these men." "Yes," she whispered. "He is the commanding officer of the fort, Colonel Alistair Thorne." Hinto flinched as if she had struck him. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and poisoned. He stared at her, his face becoming an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes were a vortex of shock pain and a betrayal so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the cave. He took a step back from her, then another, the movement stiff, unnatural. He looked at her as if she were a venomous snake he had unknowingly taken to his breast. The connection between them, the warmth, the unspoken affection, it all vaporized in an instant, replaced by a chasm of icy silence. He knew that name, and Selina, seeing the look on his face, knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that her father was far more than just a soldier to this man. He was a monster. The silence in the cave was a living thing, suffocating and absolute. Hinto stood by the entrance, his back to her, a silhouette against the shimmering curtain of water. He was as still as the stone around him, but Selina could feel the storm raging within him. The name Colonel Alistair Thorne had been the spark that ignited a powder keg of buried anguish. "Hinter," she ventured, her voice trembling. "What is it? What's wrong?" He turned slowly, and the face he showed her was that of a stranger. The gentle caretaker, the quiet philosopher, was gone. In his place was a man whose eyes held the bleak, desolate landscape of a battlefield after the slaughter. "Colonel Alistair Thorne," he repeated the name, an obscenity on his tongue. "He is known to my people. We call him Wanaji Manu, the ghost stealer, the butcher of Ash Creek." Selina felt a wave of nausea. The Butcher of Ash Creek. It was a name she had heard whispered among disgruntled soldiers, a name that was never spoken in her father's presence. It referred to a pacification mission 2 years ago, one her father had led. He had called it a great victory, a necessary action to secure the territory. He had been decorated for it. He'd told her they'd fought a band of hostile warriors. "That was my father's victory." She said the words, tasting like poison. "He said they engaged warriors who had been raiding settlements." A sound like a choked, bitter laugh escaped Hinto's throat. "Warriors." He took a step toward her, his movement filled with a predator's menace she had never seen before. "My son Hokshila was 5 winters old. Was he a warrior when a soldier's bullet tore through his chest? My wife Kankuna was scraping a hide by the creek. Was she a warrior when they cut her down?" He was close now, looming over her. The grief radiating from him was a physical force, a heat that scorched the air. It was not a battle. It was a massacre, a small camp of 30 people, old men, women, children. We were not hostile. We were living as our fathers had before us. Your father, the ghost stealer, waited until the men were away on a hunt. He descended on our homes at dawn and slaughtered them. He burned our tippies, he shot our horses. He left nothing but blood on the snow." Selina stared at him, her world collapsing. The image of her father, stern, commanding, but always her protector, was shattering, replaced by the portrait of a monster. The stories, the honor, the medals, all lies, built on the bodies of children and unarmed women. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. He did," Hinto hissed his voice, cracking with the agony of the memory. "I returned 2 days later, to find nothing. To find everything. I found my son's small moccasin lying in the blood-stained snow. That is all I have left of him. That is the great victory your father gave me." The truth of it, the sheer, unadorned horror, slammed into Selina. She saw it all in his eyes, the fire, the screams, the unbearable silence that followed. And she finally understood the profound, bottomless well of sadness she had always sensed in him. It wasn't just sorrow. It was a wound that could never, ever heal. And her father had inflicted it. Her blood ran in the veins of the man who had destroyed his world. The hand that had tended her wounds belonged to a man whose family was murdered by the men her father commanded. The kindness he had shown her, the fragile bond they had formed, was a grotesque irony, a cruel joke played by a merciless fate. I didn't know." She choked out tears streaming down her face. "Hinto, I swear to you I didn't know. I knew he was a hard man, a man of violence, but I never this." "You wear his name," Hinto said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You are his blood. Every time I look at you, I see his face. The spirits sent you to me. I thought it was a test of my compassion. Now I see it as a test of my sanity." He turned away from her, slamming his fist against the cave wall. The sound echoed the shattering of Selina's heart. "All this time," he spat his back still to her, "I have been caring for my enemy. I have shared my food, my fire, my stories, with the daughter of the man who left me with nothing but ghosts. I am not my father." She cried the words torn from her soul. "I ran from him. I hate the world he built, the things he stands for." It does not matter, he roared, whirling back to face her. You cannot run from your own blood. It is in you. The world he built gave you the food you ate, the clothes you wear, the very horse that carried you here. You are a part of it, whether you wish it or not. The chasm between them was now complete, a canyon carved by blood and history that no bridge could span. The tenderness they had shared was now a source of shame for him and agony for her. He looked at her with eyes that saw only the ghost of her father, and she looked at him, the man she was beginning to love, and saw the profound, irreparable damage her family had wrought. What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Hinto stared at her for a long, torturous moment. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes. One moment, illuminating the killer within the next, the broken man. The urge for vengeance, for a final violent release of his pain, warred with the memory of her laughter and the feel of her hand as she gave him the small carved hawk. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and final as a winter grave. "Your leg is almost healed. In 2 days you will be strong enough to ride. I will take you to the edge of the town of Deadwood. I will leave you there. Then I will go where the ghosts of your people cannot find me." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her one last time, filled with a mixture of revulsion and a deep, aching regret. "And I will spend the rest of my days trying to forget the color of your eyes." The 2 days that followed were an exercise in silent torture. The warmth and life had been leached from the cave, leaving behind a cold, damp tomb filled with unspoken accusations and regrets. Hinto was a phantom. He moved with his customary silence, but it was no longer a comforting presence. It was the silence of alienation. He provided food, he refilled her canteen, but he did so without looking at her, leaving the items near her bedroll as if she were an object, not a person. He did not speak a single word. For Selina, every moment was agony. She watched him, her heart aching, trying to find a flicker of the man she had come to know. But his face was a mask of granite. His eyes distant, focused on a past she could never change. She understood his hatred. It was righteous, it was earned. But it didn't stop the pain of his rejection, a pain that was sharper than her healing bone. She was being judged and condemned for a crime she didn't commit yet, for which she bore an inescapable stain of guilt. She was the living, breathing legacy of his tormentor. On the morning of the 3rd day, Hinto approached her, leading a scruffy-looking Mustang he must have tracked and caught. It was a wiry, resilient creature of the plains. "You will ride," he said. It was the first sentence he had spoken to her since the revelation. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He helped her onto the horse with the same impersonal efficiency with which he had tended her wounds. His touch was firm, brief, and sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He mounted his own horse, a powerful Appaloosa, and without a backward glance started the journey. They traveled east toward the rough-and-tumble mining town of Deadwood. The beauty of the Pahasapa, which she had come to appreciate through his eyes, now seemed mocking. The sun-drenched canyons, the whispering pines, the soaring eagles. They were all witnesses to her heartbreak. The silence between them was a heavy shroud. It was broken only by the plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the sigh of the wind. Several times, Selina opened her mouth to speak, to apologize again, to explain, to plead. But what could she say? "I'm sorry my father murdered your family," felt like a pathetic, meaningless insult. There were no words to bridge the river of blood that flowed between them. Hinto rode slightly ahead, his back a rigid wall of rejection. He was a perfect guide, navigating the treacherous terrain with innate skill, but he was no longer her companion. He was her warden, delivering her to the edge of his world, so he could be free of her. On the second night of their journey, they made a cold camp in a small, sheltered copse of aspens. He built a small fire but sat on the opposite side, his blanket pulled around him, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer in their dance. Selina couldn't bear it anymore. "Hinter," she said, her voice raw. He didn't move, but she knew he was listening. I know there is nothing I can say to change what happened, to fix what my father did." She began, tears gathering in her eyes. "But I need you to know that the time in the cave, it changed me. You showed me a world, a way of being that I never knew existed. You showed me what honor and kindness really are, and I—" her voice broke. "I will never forget it. Or you." He remained silent for a long time. The fire crackled spitting embers into the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with a pain he could no longer completely conceal. "When I was a boy, my father taught me that every person has two wolves inside them. One is anger, envy, sorrow, and hate. The other is joy, peace, love, and hope. He told me, the one that wins is the one you feed." He turned his head and looked at her, his eyes hollow in the firelight. "For 2 weeks you made me forget which wolf to feed. You made me hope. Hope is a dangerous thing for a man like me. It makes the memory of what was lost sharper. It makes the emptiness deeper." He turned back to the fire. "It is better to feel nothing." His words were a confession of his own turmoil, a glimpse into the war he was fighting. He wasn't just pushing her away out of hatred for her father. He was pushing her away to protect himself from the agony of caring for someone again, only to inevitably lose them. In his world, love and loss were two sides of the same coin. The next day, they reached a high ridge overlooking the sprawling, chaotic scar of Deadwood. The sounds of the town shouting saloon pianos, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, drifted up to them in the wind. It was the sound of her world, the sound of everything he despised. "This is as far as I go," Hinto said, reining in his horse. "Follow this trail down. You will be there in an hour. You have money. You can buy passage on a stagecoach and disappear." Selina looked from the grimy town back to his proud, sorrowful face. Leaving him felt like cutting out a piece of her own heart. This was it, the end of their journey. "Hinto, She was cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle shot from the trees to their right. Hinto's horse reared with a scream. Hinto reacted instantly, throwing himself from the saddle and pulling his own rifle free as he hit the ground. "Ambush!" he yelled, his voice the sharp command of a warrior. "Get down!" More shots erupted from the trees. A bullet whizzed past Selina's ear. She tumbled from her horse, her heeling leg screaming in protest as she landed hard. From the woods emerged a dozen figures. Half were soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, and leading them, a triumphant, cruel smirk on his face, was Captain Marcus Jennings. Beside him, his face a thundercloud of stern fury, sat Colonel Alistair Thorne. "Well, well, Selina," Captain Jennings called out, his voice dripping with condescending victory. "It seems your little adventure is over. Your father and I have come to take you home." Colonel Thorne's cold eyes were fixed on Hinto, who was crouched behind a rock, his rifle ready. "And as for the savage who absconded with you," the colonel said, his voice like chipping ice, "he will be dealt with accordingly." They were trapped. There was nowhere to run. The long, cold ride to farewell had just become a battle for their lives. The world exploded into a chaos of noise and violence. Rifle fire echoed off the rocks, kicking up dust and splintering pine bark. Hinto was a blur of motion, a force of nature unleashed. He fired his Winchester with deadly accuracy, not to kill but to disable. He aimed for shoulders and legs, his movements economical and precise. He was a warrior defending his ground, but Selina saw with a sudden, painful clarity that he was also a man trying to survive without becoming the butcher her father was. "He's cornered," Captain Jennings yelled with glee, firing his pistol wildly. "Spread out. Take him alive, if you can. The colonel wants to make an example of him." Colonel Thorne sat on his horse, a stoic commander, observing a tactical maneuver, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. His gaze was locked on Hinto, but it flickered to Selina, a look of profound disappointment and possessive anger in his eyes. Selina was pressed against the dirt behind a fallen log, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind was a whirlwind of terror and a strange new clarity. This was her two worlds colliding. On one side was her father, Captain Jennings, and the civilized order they represented, an order built on violence, control, and lies. On the other was Hinto, a man they called savage, who had shown her nothing but honor, gentleness, and a painful, beautiful truth. The choice, she realized, had already been made. It had been made in the cave listening to poetry. It had been made when he taught her to carve. It had been made on the long, silent ride when his pain became her own. "Selina, stay down," her father commanded, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "We will handle this filth and take you home. Home." The word was a mockery. Home was the gilded cage she had fled. Home was a lie. Hinto was outnumbered, and they were closing in. He was forced to retreat from one rock to another, his movements becoming more desperate. A bullet grazed his arm, and he grunted in pain, blood staining his buckskin sleeve. He was going to be killed or captured. They were going to drag him back to the fort, put him in chains, and hang him as a spectacle. The thought was unbearable. At that moment, something inside Selina snapped. The fear was burned away by a cold, resolute fury. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice ringing with an authority that momentarily stunned everyone into silence. The shooting faltered. All eyes turned to her. She limped out from behind the log, placing herself in the open space between the two sides. She stood between Hinto and her father's guns. "Selina, get back here this instant!" Colonel Thorne roared, his composure finally cracking. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. She looked directly at her father, and for the first time in her life, she did not see a figure to be feared or obeyed. She saw a small, tyrannical man, hollowed out by his own cruelty. "I will not go back with you. I will not marry this brute," she said, gesturing with contempt at Captain Jennings. "And I will not let you harm this man. This man is a savage, an enemy of progress." Jennings sputtered, his face red with indignation. "This man," Selina retorted, her voice rising with passion, "saved my life when your civilized world left me for dead. He showed me more humanity in 3 weeks than I have seen from you or my father in 20 years. He is not the savage here." She turned her gaze back to her father. The look on his face was one of utter shock and betrayal. He was being defied publicly by his own daughter in defense of a Lakota warrior. It was the ultimate humiliation. "You speak of treason, daughter," the colonel said, his voice dangerously low. "You have been brainwashed by this heathen. Now step aside, or so help me, God, you will be moved. If you want him, you will have to shoot through me," Selina said, her chin held high. She took another painful step backward, closing the distance to Hinto's position. It was the diversion he needed. While all eyes were on Selina and her father, Hinto had been working. He let out a piercingly sharp whistle, a sound that cut through the tension. From the trees behind him, his Appaloosa, which had run off in the initial chaos, burst forth. It had been trained to come to his call. In the same motion, Hinto shoved a small buckskin pouch into Selena's hand. "Toss this into their midst when I move," he whispered urgently. Then he launched himself from behind the rock. He didn't run toward his horse. He ran directly at the soldiers, letting out a fearsome Lakota war cry. The move was so unexpected, so audacious, that the soldiers flinched back in surprise. "Now," he yelled. Selena didn't hesitate. She threw the pouch with all her might. It landed near the soldiers' horses, bursting open in a cloud of fine grey powder. It was a mix of dried peppers and pollen, a trickster's tool. The horses, smelling the irritant, began to scream and rear their eyes, rolling in panic. The soldiers' line broke as they fought to control their terrified mounts. In that perfect moment of chaos, Hinto vaulted onto the back of his charging Appaloosa, leaning down and scooping Selena up behind him with a powerful arm around her waist. He wheeled the horse around and spurred it toward the dense forest, away from the trail to Deadwood. "After them!" Colonel Thorne bellowed, his face purple with rage, his authority collapsing into chaos. A few wild shots followed them, but they were already disappearing into the pines. Selena clung to Hinto, her face buried in his back, the wind whipping her hair. She risked one last look over her shoulder. The last thing she saw was her father, sitting motionless on his horse amidst the frantic scene, his grand ambitions and patriarchal control defeated not by a bullet, but by his own daughter's choice. He looked small, old, and utterly alone. They were free, but they were fugitives. They had no destination, no allies, and they were hunted by the U.S. Army. Their old lives were burned to the ground behind them. Ahead lay only the vast, unforgiving wilderness and an uncertain future. But as Selena held tight to the man who had lost everything she knew, she had finally found where she belonged. The healing was far from over for both of them, but for the first time, they were facing the same direction, riding together into the unknown dawn. And so their journey truly began. They were two fugitives, a man running from a past that had been stolen from him, and a woman escaping a future that was never hers. They rode not towards a town or a fort, but towards an idea, a place of peace, somewhere in the vast, untamed heart of the continent where their two worlds could finally become one. Their love was not a simple fairy tale ending. It was a promise forged in the crucible of tragedy and rebellion. It could not erase the scars of the past, but it offered the hope of a future where those wounds might finally begin to heal. They were a testament to the fact that even in an age of brutal conflict and manifest destiny, the most powerful force on the frontier was not a gun or a government, but the stubborn, resilient connection between two human souls. If their story of survival sacrifice and the enduring power of love touched your heart, please take a moment to honor their journey. Hit that like button to let us know you were here. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a tale with true grit and heart, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories from the untamed pages of history to share with you. Thank you for listening.